Hey everyone, Darren Austin Hall here for anyone who cares to listen to what I have to say. Just gonna adjust my little stand here for my phone. So yeah, I apologize in advance if the internet connection is a little shaky. I'm currently in San Jose, in the capital in Costa Rica, staying at a wonderful friend's house, and I've been working on some articles. I'm going to be actually moving some of my Facebook posts over to Medium to share more article style things about everything that's going on, my own perspectives for whatever they matter. And yeah, but with everything that's been going on, I just thought I'd share a video just to share some of my thoughts and feelings on the matter. So I just want to start off by saying that my heart really goes out to George Floyd's family and to everyone who's dealt with in the Black community and people of color from any sort of racial injustice and police brutality. These things are absolutely terrible, and we need to find a way to totally eradicate them from our civilization at large. Racism is disgusting. It's psychopathy. It should not exist on our planet any longer in the 21st century. We have more than enough understanding and intelligence to really transform these things, and there's a lot of work that obviously still needs to be done, and I'm very hopeful that work is being done and will continue being done. There's been such a beautiful response in terms of peaceful protesting, and also just allowing the space for the inevitable catharsis of Black communities and people of color who are very angry right now, and that space needs to be given for that anger to exist. But I also wanted to share that for me, these issues go so much deeper than racism, and not just for me. Yesterday, on what was known as Blackout Tuesday, I spent a lot of time actually during the day listening to talks by Black activists and Black spiritual leaders, and I was really blown away to witness some of their perspectives. And one of those videos I shared on Facebook yesterday by a beautiful brother who was apparently a Black Lives Matter organizer in Ferguson, where they had really massive protests after some police brutality there, I think in 2017. And I highly recommend watching that video just to get a sense of someone who is working within the Black community towards dealing with these things and the things that he's seen in the community, which I think are really relevant in terms of talking about infiltration of movements, even like Black Lives Matter and Antifa, infiltration by nefarious entities, whether they be police or other authorities. And that's really horrible when you hear tales like that. And there's many people in the Black community who will speak about that, and people of other different racial creed or of races, talking about how movements tend to be infiltrated, noble movements especially. This is something that Malcolm X talked about, and so many civil rights leaders talk about some of the duplicity we're up against with the state, if you want to call it that, as kind of the oppositional force. But it's really important to be aware of these things, because right now there is a really powerful protest movement happening, and it's being co-opted in certain instances by people who do not have a very nice agenda, who are wanting to harm fellow humans and destroy property, and has no connection to the catharsis, I don't think, that I was speaking of. I think there's an agenda at foot, and when you look at the coordinated efforts that are being documented by people on their phones and shooting videos of bricks being dropped off here and there, and vandals being allowed within police view, and vandals who are being called out by protesters, Black protesters as well, to stop co-opting the movement and trying to incite it into violence. And this is something that came to my attention back in 2007. There was a G6 meeting in Montebello, Quebec in Canada. And there was a very infamous incident, I'm wondering if people are aware of it, where, and you can watch the video, I can link it here, where you had a bunch of peaceful protesters demonstrating right in front of a police line. And then these very violent, belligerent protesters showed up, all dressed in black with black masks on, and they had stones in their hands, and they were trying to incite and push the protesters into the cops and incite violence. And the peaceful protesters pushed back on them and said, "What are you doing? This is a peaceful protest. We are trying to use nonviolence. Don't denigrate and vitiate what we're trying to do," which is a very effective protest action. And eventually, one of the leaders of the protesters looked down at the provocative protesters and noticed that their boots were the exact same as the police officers, and the protesters surrounded these belligerent protesters and basically denounced them as undercover police. And you could see in the police line, the police were obviously new because they were very anxious, and they eventually just pushed these violent protesters towards the cops, and the cops kind of like gently arrested them, and then you could see in full view the boots were exactly the same. This caused such outrage that the Quebec police had to actually admit on camera on the news that they had done this, that they had planted provocateurs into the protest to try and co-opt the protest and make it into a violent protest, because if it's a violent protest, then it's all of a sudden a criminal protest. It can be denounced. The noble causes of the protest suddenly get smeared, and it's a very effective tactic and very duplicitous tactic to actually take the power away from a true noble protest. Now, to me, that was very shocking when I discovered that, to think that the actual police were capable of such trickery was really disheartening to know that that's kind of what we're up against. But on the other hand, it makes perfect sense, because non-violence is one of the most powerful forces that our world has ever seen. I grew up in my 20s after I had a kind of spiritual awakening. I grew up studying nonviolence very deeply, mostly Gandhi's form of nonviolence, and I studied his writings very deeply, and I even embodied and used nonviolence in a few different episodes in my life to break up confrontations, even racial confrontations. And it's very effective, but it's very hardcore if you are truly going to be one for nonviolence. And if you really read Gandhi's writings, he really said it's about laying your life down on the line in front of violence. It's not for the faint of heart, but it is a very effective way to neutralize tyranny in the world. And I think that's one of the reasons that nonviolent protest movements are often infiltrated and attempted to be co-opted into violence, because I think the powers that be know that nonviolence is that powerful. I mean, when you look at Gandhi's nonviolent movement, they managed to actually push out the British Empire using nonviolence, just to show you how powerful it is. Martin Luther King admired Gandhi tremendously and used nonviolence as well for the Black Civil Rights Movement, which was successful in some capacities. And even Nelson Mandela and other great leaders have instituted nonviolence because they know it's that effective. So the reason I wanted to mention that, and I'm just going to move this stand back because it's slowly following. The reason I wanted to mention that is because I think what we need to understand right now is that there's a spiritual aspect to what's going on right now that needs to be really empowered. And I know there's a lot of vogue criticism that goes around these days about denouncing New Agey spirituality and conscious communities, and I actually share a lot of those criticisms. I've always kind of pushed back against New Age spirituality. I myself have found my spirituality in authentic sources of working with, training with Native American elders, and going super hardcore into esoteric traditions such as Gnosticism. And those are very disciplined paths, and they're very much paths about integration and authenticity. And uh, what I feel is important right now is that we realize that a lot of the problems that are happening in our world right now are because of a dualistic thinking program. And I've been really trying to caution people that we have to really transcend beyond all the labels that are being thrown around right now. Everyone's labeling each other left or right, and they're putting each other in this box, and it's creating a lot of rigid thinking, and it's really containing this expansive consciousness which really needs to happen right now. And you know, you can look at my skin color and say this is just a white idea, but no, not at all. Actually, a lot of the black activists I was watching yesterday, they're saying the same thing, that we have to get beyond seeing things in duality. We have to realize that the left and the right wing, those parties, are playing us. And as this gentleman said yesterday in his talk, which I shared, you know, the right wing is an easy enemy because they're very straightforward. But the left wing is incredibly cunning, but they're both very, very corrupt. And I think right now what is being called for is that we don't need more elections. I think most people share with me a kind of cynicism that every election that I voted in my entire life has been a choice between the lesser of two evils, and I'm just downright tired of this bullshit. Uh, I can't even remember seeing one single political leader in my life, aside from maybe Bernie Sanders, who inspired me in some way, and who in my mind embodied some kind of spiritual consciousness that would be able to heal these horrendous rifts of left and right that everyone seems to be falling prey to nowadays. Um, what we need is, we need to realize that the problem is happening on the level of consciousness. We need to go within and create a really powerful transformation on the level of consciousness. And this is one of the reasons that I am currently doing the presence process for the third time. And if you haven't heard of the presence process, I highly recommend looking up the text. It is actually a work of integrating childhood trauma, but it's also about becoming emotionally mature and becoming a responsible adult. And this was a process that was brought to my attention by Dr. Gabor Mate, who you might know. He's an eminent doctor and thinker and philosopher who has become very popular in the world for very good reason, because he's helping people to understand the roots of addiction in trauma and generational trauma, and understanding that a lot of our civilization is really burdened and rooted in this generational trauma that is not dealt with, that is transferred from generation to generation, leading to us dealing with the same crap time and time again, and no one's breaking this cycle of samsara, to borrow from the Buddhists. So the presence process was recommended by Gabor Mate after I completed this 10-day integration ayahuasca retreat with him down in Yelapa, Mexico. And I've done the process twice. It's recommended to do it 3 times. It's a 10-week program. It's very intense, but it's beautiful. You do 2 breathwork meditations. You work through an affirmation each week that changes with teachings through each chapter. And you don't use any mind-altering substances, including marijuana, alcohol, for those 10 weeks. And it's about getting to the root causal realm, the more vibrational realm of energy, to deal with our emotional triggers, our emotional imprints, what Wilhelm Reich, who's a psychologist who I very much admire, called the emotional plague. And this is the biggest problem that's facing our humanity, is that we're carrying this deep trauma, not only from our own personal lives, but from our generational lives, that co-ops our consciousness so that we act out and project our emotions onto others, and we become hijacked and are not able to think clearly and get our lives together because we're constantly being tormented by these emotions. And my God, if you just look at social media and you look at what's playing out in the world right now, you just see a species, human species, that is completely ensnared in a lot of emotional immaturity. And people are being triggered to be antagonistic against one another and labeling each other. It's just, to me, it's so childish when people start labeling each other this and that. it just brings me back to being in school, you know, and people just calling each other's names, which dehumanizes and makes it much easier to other someone and thus objectify them to be abused. It's a horrendous pattern that we have to break. And that's why I've been recommending, my gosh, more and more people do the presence process. It is more than necessary right now for us to become a more mature species. We are incredibly immature. Our consciousness is very fragmented. And if we're going to really fix the world and really fix these horrendous problems that have been hurting us and smiting us for generations, we have to start with ourselves. We have to be that change that we want to see in the world. I know it sounds kind of like just redundant to say that at this point, but Gandhi was onto something, and all the great spiritual teachers were onto something. And I think people need to realize that the great civil rights activists, the great leaders who have created change in this world, were deeply spiritual people. They were people who were able to transcend any dualistic thinking about us versus them, right versus left. They were people who were able to look at their supposed enemy and somehow see their humanity, and thus create a context for healing to occur, not a context for conflict. And this requires really, really deeply developed human beings, such as some of the people that I've mentioned. These are rare individuals, but they're showing a way, a common way for all human beings. And I think now more than ever, we need these kinds of leaders who are both political but also spiritual. And Gandhi said this in depth in his writings, that spirituality and politics should never be separated. They are one and the same in a certain level. And we really have to start on a process of discovery of what he was talking about and embodying that in ourselves, not just intellectually, but really embodying it in ourselves. We have to ask ourselves, what does it take when a leader is able to look at an opposing force and somehow see them as family in some sort of way, a broken part of their family, maybe a psychopathic part of their family, but something that they do not hate, that they somehow are able to rally a very creative, some lame ass naivete that's just going to create a hugathon and just endlessly passively do prayers inside, away from the front lines of the skirmish. No, these were people who created movements where people went to the front lines and were beaten, sometimes close to or even to death, while being devoted to not reacting with any violence. They were incarcerated. I know Gandhi himself was incarcerated dozens of times. These are incredible hardships that they embodied. And this is a use of aggression in a healthy way, of really showing that there's a warrior side of love, a very brilliant and powerful side of love that is hardly embodied in our world. It's hardly modeled to us in our media, in our movies. And frankly, I believe one of the reasons that it's not modeled to us is because the media and the government and the powers that be that we're struggling against are all connected in a certain way, and they do not want people to know about nonviolence. They do not want people to know about this greater way to revolt against this kind of oppression that's happening in the world. But if you look back at these movements, if you look back at Gandhi, Martin Luther King, I think of Rachel Corrie as well, who is an activist in Israel. If you just search out nonviolent movements and you look at the leaders and you look at the people who were, you'll notice that the political and spiritual realms were married. And that created an unstoppable force that there's not a tyranny on the planet that can withstand when it's wielded in the right way. The problem is when we start to negotiate our terms through violence and we start to allow ourselves to be violated to the point where we become perpetually violent, we lose all sense of clear-mindedness and we lose the powers of love, and then it just turns into chaos. And I know that's quite a tall order to say when you're dealing with police brutality, when you're dealing with being a minority in this world and you don't have the privilege of someone like me being a white male. But this is just the terms that have been laid out by our leaders who have done this work before. They tell you that this is just the way it is. If we're really going to change things in the world in a very enduring way, non-violence is super, super powerful. And it may be the only way to really do it in a way that is right and that actually works. So I wanted to just share about that. I've so much to share today. I'm sorry if I'm just rambling on. Month, my birthday's coming up and I'm a Gemini, so I'm just full on in my Mercury power right now. But another thing I just wanted to really talk, this goes way beyond racism. And in the Beautiful Brothers video that I shared yesterday, who's a former Black Lives Matter organizer, I shared that quote, that he also is saying that this is much deeper than a race issue. And this is something that has been really coming out more in human consciousness, and people are writing about it on Facebook and stuff. And that is the fact that we're dealing with forces within our government that are very shadowy, that are very conspiratorial in design. And I know it's really popular right now. My own perspective on this is that, as someone who's been researching the shadowy, clandestine forms of government for 2 decades now, ever since I was studying media information technoculture at university, conspiracies are real. Just give you a whole list of things that people said were bullshit from day one about the government and the shadowy ways they're working, unimaginable kinds of collusion. But later on, when the light of truth, which is indomitable, comes out, you see that these conspiratorial designs were built into the very fabric and mechanism of what's happening in our world. And I want to be careful here in the sense, because when people talk about the Illuminati and they get into this like they kind of thing, look, on a certain level, all consciousness is one continuum. So whenever we're dealing with any kind of rendering of a duality, which is important because in third dimension things are dualistic, but we have to understand that in the multi-dimensional understanding that even Western science is now starting to recognize as how more than one thing can be true at the same time, and we have to develop very nimble forms of mindfulness to hold all of these things, to constellate them into a mandala of meaning. That's why true spirituality is a very next level thing. It's about disciplines of meditation and contemplation where someone can really become a complex thinker, while at the same time being able to hold discernments of truth that are usually very clear and simple to the point, that can be explained to children. So on this matter, I wanted to share something, because I know there's a lot of people, when they deride conspiracy theories, they make fun of this thing that David Icke talks about a lot, about the reptiles and the lizards and stuff. And that seems to be like one of the best ways to shut down a conspiracy theory. So you're totally crazy, you believe in aliens, like these lizard reptiles and stuff that are preying upon us. Well, yeah, I came across the lizard stuff a very long time ago as well, and I thought it was absolute bullshit when I first read it. But something, I shouldn't say absolute, I thought it was mostly bullshit, but there was something about it that kind of that piqued my interest. There was something that my intuition was saying, that there was something right to this. I entertained the idea for a while, and it scared the bejesus of me to consider that our reality is actually under threat by an alien species that is predating on human consciousness. And before you leave this live thinking, oh wow, Darren's just gone off the wayside, I want to share with you something very startling that's going to probably blow your mind as it blew mine. And that is this, that when you look back, ancient ancestors were telling us, I for one have become very, very involved in the study of a document called the Nag Hammadi Library, which was found in Nag Hammadi, Upper Egypt, in 1947. It's the only living document we have of the Gnostics, which was a term given to the great sages of Eurasia, who inhabited and worked through the mystery schools, of which the pyramids of Egypt were part of these great institutions of wisdom. Such high wisdom that we can hardly even understand, because these cultures were absolutely decimated by the psychopathic empires that were to come. But this Nag Hammadi library, it's a bunch of fragmented texts written in Coptic, found in urns by literally a farmer who was digging up his land. And these documents are dated almost 2,000 years old, and they may be the only living documents we have of the Gnostics. Now, these documents talk about a lot of things. If you go onto my YouTube channel, I recently did a video talking about the mythology of the goddess Sophia, which is one of the things that they talk about in the ancients. They revered that the planet Earth was a goddess called Sophia, the goddess of wisdom. Really powerful story that we need to integrate into our understanding of the world. But one of the more interesting things they talk about is these Archons, Archons. You can Google them, though I will admit that if you Google them now, they have been co-opted by a lot of the paranoid, delusional aspects of conspiracy theory culture, which is there as well. Every culture has its shadow and its light, its delusions. And unfortunately, this Archon idea has been really co-opted and distorted. But if you look back at the source text where this information comes from, what is described, which is the pertinent information I want to share with you today, is that the Gnostics were warning humanity that we have in our midst, in our reality, entities that are non-human, that are predating on our minds, that are literally preying on our minds. This is why Graham Hancock did a TED talk called The War on Consciousness. I highly recommend watching that talk. It was censored by TED on erroneous grounds of being pseudoscience. Luckily, that crime of censorship against Mr. Hancock was reversed, and the talk was then put back up on the TEDx platform, though in a back channel. But he really also is very accurate in that talk about this. This is where the real war is happening. This is where the divisions are really being seeded between us. And racism is one of the symptoms of this greater cause that is happening. So this wasn't just the Gnostics as well. If you have ever read Carlos Castaneda's text, his shamanic teacher Don Juan also talks about these non-human entities called the predators. That's literally what they're called, a predatory species. And actually human consciousness to have literally put a kind of mechanism in our minds that has distorted the clear evolution of human consciousness. He literally calls it the foreign installation and describes it to Carlos as when he sees the human being on a more energetic level. He says the human being is like an ellipsis, like an egg with many layers, which correlates with the koshas of yoga and the subtle bodies of Western esoteric science. And he basically says that in the mind, the foreign installation makes the mind, the light, the radiance of the mind look like this, like it's going back and forth in duality consciousness. And he actually describes it as it looks kind of sinister, like unhealthy. And he says that human beings have the means to break free from this foreign installation in a beautiful, graceful, spiraling formation. That's really what human consciousness is supposed to be in our natural way as. I found this very fascinating. So I went on to study more and more about this idea of where's the... Maybe because my dear friend Omrak, who's a Mayan shamaness, the first time she gave me a reading almost 20 years ago, and it made perfect sense. I've always been drawn to studying darkness and trying to understand it in a level-headed way. So I studied the Archons, and then I studied Castaneda's writings on the predatory alien species. And then I also discovered, teachings of the fallen angels in the Bible, and of course in the Native American teachings. Various tribes call these entities Wetiko. And you start to see what I'm trying to say here. What I'm trying to get through to us is to understand that this isn't just some bullshit conspiracy, a bunch of lizard reptile aliens. This is documented by our ancestors. They were trying to warn us. This is why spirituality all of a sudden became incredibly important. Meditation is also a means of self-defense. As these Gnostics said, as a lot of shamans say, one of the great shamanic insights that I've learned from some of the shamanic teachers I've worked with is that the human mind is an open concept. It's an open vessel. Not all of your thoughts are your own. This is why discernment is so important in Buddhism and disidentification in yoga from the mind, so that we can truly introspect and realize when thoughts come into our mind, we can be Socratic with them, we can question them and try and understand, is this my autonomous sovereign mind? Is this my heart intuitive consciousness, which is always closer to the truth, the portal of where the goddess Sophia, the inner wisdom, speaks from, the Mahaguru? Or is this some kind of predatory entity implanting a thought into my mind that is not my own, that it is parasitically feeding off of and trying to get me off my dharmic path? This is very important to be aware of, because a lot of the theories of what's going on right now is that our world leaders, as the Gnostics 2,000 years ago were trying to say, the leaders of their time of the growing empires of Roman Christianity, they were trying to warn that our world leaders have been absolutely possessed. Possession is truly one of the greatest problems that we're dealing with on our planet. That our leaders have been possessed by these entities, and then they've projected this possession through the media, through all the different images and information that we have, so that we all become infected. This is the real pandemic that's been happening for eons on the level of the mind. This is why I believe the movement forward is that we need a spiritual revolution of consciousness on the planet. If we really, really want to work on the causal realm and really eradicate racism and all these bullshit division games that have been plaguing us for so long, we need to work on the level of consciousness. So moving forward, what I'm starting to see increasingly is the need for communities to come together, to start to build eco-villages, to start to create new civilizations away from the old one that is dying and collapsing. I am no longer interested in voting and trying to affect change at the ballot box. To me, it's futile. It's just feeding a dead and noxious system. We truly need to create new ideas and new systems. We need to think out of the box, and we need to get creative. We need to sit down with each other, the brilliance of the human mind, and realize the original blessing that we have as geniuses that have been created by the divine, as the Gnostics said, created by a goddess herself, in consort with a god, with the aeons coupling together in the center of the galaxy. If you want to get really sci-fi, that's what the ancients believed. And we need to really start to envision a world beyond this mess of duality, beyond this political system. We truly need a revolution. We needed it yesterday. We need to start get creative and think about what can we do. I am personally right now living in Costa Rica, and I've decided to move down here, and I'm already mobilizing with people down here. There are so many communities teaming here, and we are realizing that the common ground is the earth. The indigenous people knew this. When you live in rapport with the earth and follow the ecological laws of sustaining life through the earth, of nurturing crops, nurturing food, working with the cycles of the season, working with the cycles of the elements, you are equalized because you're all working through the same system, the ecology of the planet. That is, to me, one of the most pertinent things moving forward. We need to find ways to recouple ourselves to the land, to get out of the cities, or at least transform the cities so monumentally that the cities are once again interfaced with nature, and not these cancerous concrete jungles that have cut themselves off and separated them from nature, which has also created cancer in our consciousness, a madness and insanity in our consciousness that has not been able to allow us to form any clear thinking about how to really rectify things on the planet, and really how to adapt as a species, not as the best, most supreme species on this planet, but just as a part of the planet's ecology. That is one of the most important things we need to do right now and moving forward. How do we adapt to live and abide by her laws in cooperation with the species, our kin on this planet, the plant and the animals? How do we truly live in interdependence? We need a war of interdependence, which ironically would end all wars, because a war of interdependence is absurd. There is no war. For if you truly acknowledge the radical perspective of interdependence, how every single thing on the planet and in the freaking universe is connected, no one would be in conflict anymore. You would realize that any harm you do to another, you're doing it onto yourself, and that is the root of insanity. And the Gnostics were very clear on this, that these archons, these reptilian kind of aliens, these interdimensional species that were predating on human consciousness, they didn't see it as a good and evil rendering. They were much smarter than that. They did not fall prey to these emotional dualities. They just called it as it is. They said these archons were insane. And there is going to be a time where we have to compassionately deal with those kinds of influences as well. And there are going to be ways that we can masterfully alchemize and create peace and rapport with these entities. This is not to freak anyone out to think that, oh my gosh, there's these scary entities in our midst that have been predating on our mind. If you have seen the movie The Wizard of Oz, it holds a very, very significant piece of information about evil. If you remember, at the end of the movie, this great monolithic tyrant, when they remove the curtain, it's just an old man with a broken heart. That's what evil is. If you look at the archons, if you look at Satan, if you look at Lucifer, if you look at all the renderings of evil in human mythological understanding, It's literally an element of creation that somehow became mentally ill based on some form of pain or suffering. There's a lack of love there. And we can heal that with an aggressive, very creative, and brilliant understanding of how to use shamanic and many healing arts. We can deal with that entity. It's not going to be everyone's job to deal with it, because that's a very high level of spiritual work. This revolution is multidimensional. We're going to need permaculturalists, we're going to need philosophers, we're going to need artists, we're going to need teachers. We're going to need everyone, all hands on deck, fighting for the beautiful spirit of humanity and fighting for a new world where we once again live in harmony with the planet and realize that the greatest ally that we have, every single human being, is Mother Earth herself, the goddess, who the ancients called Sophia, who is wisdom. The Taoists called it the guiding realm. We are always in rapport with this beautiful, beneficial goddess who is guiding us at all times. But the problem is, when we remove ourselves from our heart, from our more feminine consciousness, which is what patriarchy has done, it has exiled us from wisdom and made us live by our intellect, which is where that foreign insulation I was talking about, where duality only exists. You cannot know truth from the level of the intellect. You cannot feel what truth is on a vibrational level of spontaneous insight. That's literally how the heart speaks and how the goddess speaks through the heart, the wisdom goddess, who is Sophia, who is this planet. We are existing in her body, on her body, within her soul. This is what the ancients were talking about. So I wanted to share that because I think it's very pertinent information. And my hearts go out to everyone who's suffering right now. My hearts go out to the Black community especially. Something that I learned as well from Gandhi, is he dealt with his own privilege. He was an upper class Indian man at the time. He was sent away to university in England. He wanted to be English. He hated being Indian. And when he came home and felt racism for the first time, when he was working down in South Africa as a lawyer, and he was kicked off the train because he stubbornly refused to move from first class. And because he was deemed colored, he was asked to go and sit in third class. He refused and was kicked off the train. And that night he spent at the train station, lonely and cold. He had a life-changing revelation. He realized what oppression was, because he suddenly felt what all the poor people were feeling, which he had been insulated against for a time because he was from a rich family in India. When he started advocating and started the nonviolent movement in South Africa, which was very successful in helping the Indians achieve certain equanimity there, he returned to India, and many people wanted to co-opt his movement. Many elitist politicians wanted to use him for their own vanity, for their own power. And what did Gandhi do? He traveled, I believe, a year or even 2 years, literally going and visiting the poorest of the poor in India to hear their grief, to understand that when we are dealing, revolting, we have to look at who is most viscerally affected. And right now that is the Black community. They are being brutalized by a police and governmental system that is stoking the fires of racism, that is trying to divide us through racism. And this is anathema. This is monstrous. And we need to be aggressive in how we take care of this in a loving way. If you see any police officer confronting anyone who is of color, and you or of some privileged position, go and monitor that situation. Show up in allied support. If anyone is being brutalized, it is our duty to step in and intervene. We cannot be afraid anymore. We need to stick up for our sisters and our brothers. This needs to be human-wide. We need to get this. This is what nonviolence was all about. It wasn't in a hippy-dippy movement. This was very hardcore training about standing up for oneness and realizing we are all one family. And when we see injustice, we need to seek it out. And even a step further. Sorry, we hit out for a second. When we have to intervene on behalf of the oppressor. This is something that Gandhi was and so was Martin Luther King. Went into the minds of the oppressor, and they empathized with the oppressor to understand, where is this evil coming from? Would want to physically harm another human being by putting up some false hierarchy that they are somehow superior to them based on the color of their skin. And they discovered that there was a way to reach into the heart of the oppressor through fierce, compassionate confrontation and change their minds. It is possible. I have seen it in myself when I have actually confronted and used non-violence. I'll end this talk by just sharing one episode to just give you a sense of this. So years ago, when I was living in China and I was studying and embodying nonviolence, studying very deeply Gnostic spirituality, I was living a very disciplined spiritual life. I was at a club one night with some friends, and everyone was, having a good time, was pretty wasted, and I was abstaining from alcohol at that time. And I noticed that a friend of mine, he was, let's just call him Andrew, he was standing at the side of the dance floor, and he was a kind of guy, and he was a white guy, but he was really belligerent and angry, and I could tell that there was a kind of scene happening. And he was looking at someone on the dance floor, and he was very angry at them, and I could see this, what I had known as a very kind-hearted dude, was clearly drunk, and something bad was going to happen. And I checked myself in that moment. I remembered what Gandhi said, and he said, if you're going to confront someone who's being violent, you have to be angrier than them, angrier at the actual violence that has possessed them, that is harming their own soul and trying to convince it to do something to another person which is unjust, but also to incur horrendous karma for themselves. You have to be more angry at that than they are whatever they're angry at. That's pretty intense. And I had to stand there for a moment, really charging myself up and feeling that. And feeling that, as I'd learned from studying esoteric literature, that oftentimes when we get into that there is actually a possession happening to us on the level of spiritual dimensions, that there is a kind of negative entity, and that we need to banish that from the being that is being violent. So in that moment, I had to start to charge myself up with that courage. And I also had to be willing to take a hit, because I know Gandhi said that. If you go up to someone and use nonviolence to diffuse a violent person or a violent situation, you cannot be cowardly in an instant. You have to be willing to take a punch and even lose your life. And I literally had to contemplate that very quickly in the moment because of the situation at hand. Myself up with that noble gusto, and I walked over to my friend and I grabbed him by the shoulder, very, Andrew, what's going on? And he turned to me, and he was filled with vile vitriol. And he pointed onto the dance floor, and he said that, using the N word, describing a black friend of ours, that N dude is dancing with my girl, Lucy, for lack of a better word, or for lack of naming names. And so I looked over the dance floor, and I knew this person, this black person, was a friend of ours, and I knew this girl as well. And I didn't know they were a couple. I didn't know Andrew had a crush on this girl. And they were aware of Andrew, who was pointing at them and kind of seething at the mouth. So I could see, okay, so here's the situation. And Andrew looked at me, and he was clearly drunk. And I could tell, for one, studying esoteric literature, when you're dealing with someone who's possessed, the first thing you'll notice is they can't look you straight in the eyes. Their eyes are darting all over the place. And you really have to look at them in the eyes. You just focus on their eyes and try and bring them to that place, because the eyes actually go directly through meridians to the heart. And that's actually where the soul resides. So if you can start looking and maintaining eye contact with someone, that alone is a massive victory in pulling someone back into alignment. So he starts spitting all this hatred and anger at me about this guy, a very racial slur of what he's doing to him and his girl. And I know that with anger, it's like releasing steam from a kettle. You just allow it to be released. So I'm waiting for it to be expressed. And I also know that anger is an emotion that cannot be held for very long. It requires a lot of energy. And if you allow the person to just vent and you don't respond, they have nothing to feed on. The problem with anger is when we respond and react, it becomes this vicious circle. And then anger just grows and grows and grows to something very destructive. So I gave it space. And he vented for just about a minute or two. And then he huffed, and I could tell like he was exhausted for an instant. He didn't have the energy to keep that energy going. And that's when I knew I had a space to come in. So I came in and I was filled with such fury, but my fury was super focused. And I spoke very clearly and much louder than him. I was shouting at him and I was saying, Andrew, you are much better than this anger. Wake up. This is your friend over here on the dance floor. This is not your enemy. I don't know what this drama is, but you are much better than this. And he was shocked. He was shocked at how angry. It was like a lion just roaring at him. And he kind of came to himself. He had a moment where I could see actually sobriety in his eyes. In an instant, all that drunken energy was riveted in a moment of clarity. And his friends who were behind us, they actually all of a sudden jumped in trying to separate us because they thought a fight was happening between us, because I was so filled with this fury. And I looked each of them quickly in the eye and said, don't worry. And I transmitted such an assertive form of peace and even, joyfulness in a way that they immediately were like, oh, okay, there's something else happening here. And then Andrew, had gathered a bit more steam, and he released another angry diatribe about this whole situation. But I noticed right away, his anger was less than the first time. And I knew right there that whatever this thing, this emotion, this emotional plague, this entity, if you will, that was possessing him, I knew that it was losing. And so I waited again. I waited for him to take his time for a minute to just vent. And then the minute he finished, he sighed. And I knew that was the end of the anger. And I grabbed a medallion. He was wearing a Buddhist medallion. Because I knew him mostly as a peaceful, kind, spiritual guy. And I knew he was just... Looks like I have low storage or something, so I can continue this very fast. I grabbed this medallion and I said, brother, I'm going to take this off of your neck. You don't deserve to wear this. You are much better than this. Remember where you come from, this Buddhist symbol, who you really are. And he sighed again and he said, okay. And I said, okay, let's get you out of here. And I got him out of the club. And we went outside and he was like, oh my gosh, thank you so much, brother. I don't know what overcame me. And he was all of a sudden a totally clear and different individual. And his friends were really excited. They wanted to know, what was I doing? How did I diffuse it in that way? And that's just an example of nonviolence working in a very almost violent situation. Blabbing on and on and on, but I just wanted to share some sentiments with you on all of this. As I said, I have some writings that I'm working on right now that are going to go a little deeper into how spirituality and this political situation we're dealing with, how they can be married, and also just delving into the nature of supposed evil in our culture right now, because I think these are really relevant topics. So much love to everyone. As safe as you can be, although we're just in a dangerous time. It's hard to be safe. I don't know if it's even good for us to be safe in a certain way. Just keep radiating peace and love, and take this time to really do work like the presence process, and realize that the causal realm to deal with all of these problems lies within. We really need to shift consciousness from within and start to mobilize in our communities to really create truth, loving, heart-centered based communities, and really create a whole world system that is utterly different than the one that's falling apart in our midst. Hope springs eternal. Don't give up. Protect those that are, under threat. And let's use this time, this adversity, to really show the power of love and the power of our humanity. Thank you. Many blessings.